myths that we have, we've been given by, Sita, Draupadi. They're embodiments of women invented by men. And we were given these characters with their beauty and flaws by men. And right now, after Me Too, and it's important to imagine new characters, rethink existing ones. So in literature, there has been a resurgence of feminist retellings of myths and of classical mythology, even across the world, but also in India. And there have been the classics, the texts like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata have been told. There have always been very many different retellings of the stories. But now we have retellings seen through a feminist lens. We have the liberation of Sita by Volga. We have your Sita's Ramayana. You started off with early retelling old tales and retelling the classics. At first with your Mahabharata, which was written when you started writing it when you were 8, and you published it when you were 12, and it was a big success. But you went on to write more books. Would you like to tell me what got you writing about the Mahabharata and the Ramayana?
Thank you, Astri, for that question. And I would also like to there's a lovely lady sitting in the audience who's responsible for my whole literary career beginning. She's the reason my first book got published when I was 12. That's Samhita Radhakrishna. And she's the one who introduced me to my first publisher. So for me, thank you, Samhita. So why have I been interested in what drew me to the Mahabharata and the Ramayana? We interpret these stories, they shape our cultural psyches in very powerful ways. The Ramayana is, I think for many of us still, shapes ideas of what good and evil, right and wrong, chastity, justice, all of these things are in very problematic ways. And when we're talking about Sita and Draupadi being invented by men, I can't say for exactly who invented these stories because they sometimes exist in oral versions before they're written down. But we have had female retellers. But when I grew up, I did not know of this legacy of female retellings. I knew the Valmiki Ramayana, I knew the Tulsidas Ramayana, but I did not know that there were female versions of these stories, oral versions, or the Chandrabati Ramayana, which was written in the 16th century, or from Andhra itself, the Mulla's Ramayana, which is also written by a woman. So I think to return to that idea of many Ramayanas and see sometimes what a female perspective or voice can do, sometimes it can be also, it may not change the status quo. We often attach too much importance to gender. There are men who are more feminist than many women, and there are women who are as patriarchal as any man, any patriarch that you can come across. So I think it's less about, these questions are quite complicated. But what drew me to the Mahabharata, so for me to shift the understanding of the Ramayana, to recall these traditions, to use their support to look at these texts and investigate them in different ways, particularly for children. Sita's Ramayana is a text I hope an 8-year-old can read, is important because sometimes when we receive these myths very young and they sort of they wire the way we think, they program the way we think we should be, I think it's important to offer alternate versions of being. The Mahabharata, I think, is important for me because it's, when I was about 5 years old, my father, who was, I can say this publicly now, was in the RAW and was posted to Pakistan, where he was sort of undercover as a diplomat in the Indian consulate in Karachi. And I was, being Indian in Pakistan, this was my first memories are of Pakistan, and it's a very complicated thing to then claim that you're Indian when the first national anthem, and this is Republic Day, was the first national anthem I could sing was the Pakistani national anthem before I could sing the Indian national anthem. And when I came back to India at the age of 8, or I made the mistake of going to school and somebody asked me where I had come from and I said Karachi, Pakistan. Wrong answer. In 1992, around the time of Babri Masjid, I was ostracized in school. I was called PP, Pagal Pakistani for short. And that was a scarring experience. And I would go home, and I think to retell the Mahabharata was to assert my own Indianness through this act of writing. But it was also to tell my own story. The character that I saw, resonated the most with in the Mahabharata was Karna. And Karna is by birth a Pandava, but he's on the Kaurava's side. And this is simplistic, but I felt I was by birth an Indian, but all my classmates in school saw me as a Kaurava, saw me as a Pakistani, and I was on the wrong side. So I think the Mahabharata is more complex than it's being about right and wrong and good and evil. It is a story that keeps, and I think this is why myths are powerful. We can see our own life stories reflected in them. They help us navigate our own experience. So for me, that's the power of the Mahabharata.
But you went on to work with Tamil classics and the Sangam period of literature. What made you interested in the Shilapadikaram?
Thank you for that question. So Mahabharata, Ramayana, so many of our myths and epics are princes going to war, heroes, waging these great wars in which they're incredibly successful and they're victorious. And where are the women in these stories? They're left behind. They're having to undergo Agni Parikshas. They're left behind Lakshman Rekhas. They are Draupadi and Kunti, who kind of lead these lives of palaces and frustrations. And then you come across the Tamil epics, the Shilapadikaram, the Manimekalai. There are multiple Tamil epics there are also other epics like the Kundala Kesi, which we only exist in fragments, and the Neela Kesi, which all figure women. And these women are the central figures of these narratives and the epic length narratives. Epic length meaning that they don't follow the structure necessarily of epics, but they're very long narratives and they feature women as the heroes. But in the Shilapadikaram, it is a woman, Kannagi, who challenges the king, who demands justice. And because the king has wronged her, a common woman, he drops dead. And the city of Madurai is destroyed and Kannagi is transformed into a goddess. And I feel the story of how a woman has the power and her anger gives her the power to challenge authority, to demand justice, is very relevant, particularly in these times. So that's what attracted me to this story at this moment.
Preti, you write about women as well in your novel, and what are the feelings, what it's not rage, it's power, but you talk about your adaptation of King Lear. Power, the struggle for power, what is it in modern India that gets you talking about power?
Well, a short answer to your question is what isn't in modern India that isn't to do with power and the struggle for power? And there's a very clear question about how we can take our myths and weave them into the stories that can help us to navigate some of the most difficult questions that we have to answer socially and politically in terms of justice. And so for me, I was born in the UK, my parents are Indian, so I've got these two halves to my identity, but I see myself very much as a whole person. So I don't choose a side. I try to, in my writing, bring together myths from Indian culture, including Mahabharata. There's a character called Sita in my novel, and a character called Radha, and a character called Gargi, who's for knowledge. And these three sisters really were a way of exploring how society treats women at different ages of their lives. So first of all, there's a young woman who's Sita, and she's supposed to be a good girl, but she really wants to break out and be free to be an environmental warrior, because the environment and climate change is one of the most pressing issues that has to do with power, who gets land, who looks after land of our times, and what we're going to do with that land so that it can be sustainable. The middle sister, Radha, is, I suppose, what we know as an it girl. So she's a very fashion-conscious young woman. She's a very wealthy young woman. She punishes herself to try and keep herself looking nice all the time. And no one really thinks she has a brain. But inside her mind, she's incredibly intelligent. And so she's always on social media trying to manipulate the share price of her father's company through tweets. all the time. She's very cleverly trying to control the part of the world that no one expects her to be controlling. And she's doing that in a kind of anonymous way. Everybody is following this Twitter account, which is called Mr. G. And she sets up this Twitter account anonymously in order to critique what her father is actually doing and try to manipulate the share price so that she can become more powerful eventually. And her sister Gargi, who's the oldest of the three, she kind of represents this mother figure that we're always supposed to believe is there to nurture everybody else. But that, to me, I mean, my mother was a very nurturing person, but she was also an incredibly strong woman. And she really set me an example to say, you know, you can have your own life, you can live the way that you believe, but you can also have a family, you can nurture them, you can send your kids to school, but you can also run a business. And so this is really what Gargi's dilemma is and what she's trying to explore. Because I grew up in the UK, Shakespeare was really the centre of the canon for me, and the mythology that we get from Shakespeare in English schools is given to children from a very young age. When I heard the story of King Lear, which is about this very, very powerful Maharaja-style king and his three daughters, who he has to ask to prove how much they love him in a test in order so that they can claim land from him, it just made me feel like I was reading the story of a kind of Indian family where tests are set to say you have to show the honour that you show to your father, show to your family all the time. You have to show that in society in order to have your safety and to be taken care of. So for me it was really this melding of Mahabharata, which I got from my parents, and King Lear's stories, which I got from school, which I was trying to explore in the book. And I thought it was really interesting what you said, that you were trying to prove something about who you are. Because there's this existential question, I think, at the heart of King Lear, which is, who is it that can tell me who I am? And for me to write King Lear in an Indian context was for me to be able to say, I come from two worlds and this is how I'm going to express that.
I come from two worlds too, and it's always, people always take it as, you know, but how could you possibly be that and be comfortable in both? And there is no problem. For me, there is no problem.
No, there's no problem, and I think all of us have many languages inside us. We have many cultures that we're influenced by. We might have one thing or two things that we consider to be the core of who we really are, but all of us contain these different multitudes and many potentials to explore our identities all the way through our lives. There's no one way that we should be. And really mythology allows us to think like that, to think in all of these multiple ways. You know, Mahabharata contains characters that boys that take female identity, women who take male identity. Shakespeare does something very similar. All of us have all of these twin souls within ourselves, and however we choose to understand that and bring that out. I think literature, writing and writing with mythologies, rewriting contemporary moments can really help us to remind fixed ideologies that would like to constrain us, that actually throughout time, we've resisted that kind of constraint.
You write about Jodhbag and Nizamuddin, and you write about Kashmir. How have people reacted to what you've written about Kashmir? Particularly after the last few months.
Well, the book was written from around 2010 to 2013, and I did a lot of research here in India. I spent many months here. I was able to travel to Kashmir in 2012 to research the novel. It was a time when the army was being decommissioned, so it was actually a very unique moment in the last decade where I was able to go with just a guide, a friend of family friend, and into parts of the city where people don't usually go, and talk to a lot of people, see for myself what was happening on the ground, and the years and decades of trauma that people have had to live with, and how that's affected them generation by generation, the poverty and the post-traumatic stress from conflict that's still ongoing, as you all know. What was really strange was this place kind of possessed me. And the people I met and the things that I learned from them started my mind thinking about what might happen, and what I could see was a kind of soft colonialism that was repeating a British colonialism that had taken place there, which I'm very familiar with because I grew up in England. And I began to think about the political future of this place, like what was the end game? Because I think as fiction writers, we have to think about future now. What we can see around us is how our fiction gets formed. And I just began to think about the audacity of development, of an economic development argument that can be used to subjugate humans. And that is the nature of colonialism and neoliberalism and neocolonialism. It's a kind of economic argument which allows us to stay blind to the human cost. And I could see that so clearly in Kashmir, that in this book, there is actually a character who predicts the erasure of 377. And I wrote it in 2012. I had no idea that that was actually going to happen this summer, just gone. And, you know, when you write fiction, you hope that what you're projecting won't happen, because it's dystopian. You feel like this is the worst I can imagine. I'm going to put it in the novel, and hopefully whoever reads it, it might somehow trickle into consciousness. And then these things happen, and life overtakes fiction. And reality is just so much more strange than our imaginations want us to believe sometimes. So, you know, the way that people have responded to it have been like, how did you know? But I think, honestly, the answer is that if you look for the right signs, we all know. We all know what we can see coming in the next 10, 15 years. It's not magic. It's adding up the numbers in the right order to say, these 4 or 5 decades of suffering, this kind of economic development, these kinds of ideological arguments, what is going to happen next? And that's the question that we should be asking ourselves, even while we're protesting about what's happening now.
Would you like to read something from the book?
Sure, okay. Okay, so the book it looks really long, but actually it's told from the perspective of 6 different characters. So it's kind of discrete parts told from 6 different points of view. And there's 3 daughters, as I said, and then there's 2 sons. I'm going to read the part which I was talking about that actually predicts. King Lear starts, like I said, with this division of this kingdom between the 3 daughters. And the play begins with this enormous mistake that this man makes. He divides his kingdom, in the book it's a business, between the 3 daughters. And then obviously they end up fighting each other for control of the other 2 shares. So in the play, that is a kind of a civil war, and in the novel, that space of civil war is, of course, Kashmir, because it begins with partition and it runs all the way through to the present day. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about these 2 characters. One of them is Sita, and she has come back having run away for basically the whole book, and she's talking to her uncle. He's not really her uncle. Her father's right-hand man. In the evenings, when the birds become a 1,000-piece orchestra tuning in the sky, she wraps herself in a quilt and takes her notebook to the garden. The house is unadorned, but someone has planted outside. Palms mixed with pine trees that frame the sloping grass, shedding needles and filling the air with their scent. She wonders if she will still be here in late winter, where the dark purple shrubs will trumpet tiny pink flowers, Himalayan fingerprints, called so for their fleshy petals. She cannot remember their real names. She curls in a plastic chair, sipping lemon tea. Kritik uncle appears from the gloom around the house. A man carries his chair, another his shawl, another waits to take his order for snacks. He sits next to her, the shawl on his knees. When the snacks arrive, fresh finger chips, salt and pepper in a plastic bowl, they come with imli chutney and homemade ketchup. The taste of pre-91, Kritik uncle says, dipping a chip in tomato sauce. See how far we have come? Remember the first time we bought shares in Heinz to use in the hotels? What days? Sita was 2 years old in 91. Maybe Kritik uncle thinks he is talking to her sister, those lessons he used to give her on company history looping in his brain. As he sits with her, the night becomes charged instead of gentle. The palm silhouettes go from sprouting hair tops to fingers grabbing the clouds. Do you like this garden? Critic Uncle asks her. You know, tulips bloom in the Mughal gardens. Shalimar, Nishat, I'll take you in spring. Online, she has seen pictures of the tulips pouting at the sky in so many hopeful rows. On Sundays, she imagines families come and picnic and dress for photographs in traditional costumes, and children splash in the stone sluices that frame each patch of grass. In the summer, says Critic Uncle, then you will see how so many shikara make glide along the lake. Floating toy shops, floating shoe stalls, so many people come for honeymoon, so many come with families. Your father always understood domestic tourism as our biggest opportunity. People want to experience this thing. Some remember it from years back and want to see it again with their own eyes. Do you know how much the industry has boomed here in the last 5 years? 4 million people now come to Amarnath for pilgrimage alone. Not from your strata, but why not? Why shouldn't everyone enjoy this thing? We will offer a package to get the right class of people here only. Vision, Sita Beti, and belief. This is what you need. Just imagine the fun to be had. We should be right at the front of this thing. He takes a samosa, dips it in tomato sauce, bites off the corner. What you mean is that India has grown a big fat middle, while the people of this state have struggled under sanctions, Sita says. Such a sweet girl, he says. He finishes the samosa and his hand and chin twist upwards like a novice poet about to recite. He stares into the shadowed garden as if he can hear a beautiful gabble. You will come and develop the company here, and everyone will thank you. First, the faithful company customers will come, searching for novelty for skiing, to see saffron picking and tour inside our shawl weavers' homes. We will build a private gondola swinging high into the mountains to avoid the riffraff queuing at Gulmarg, the lame pack horses at Pahalgam. Then those that follow our story will come, wanting to be seen in the same places, and so on and so forth. The thrill of it will be this place. So life continues. Sita thinks of the women with the pictures of boys around their necks, the young men sitting on the benches by the river in the late afternoon. All the things simply seeing cannot show. Do you know how much they produce this place can yield? Critic Uncle asks. How much we can benefit from free trade? This land is so fertile, we will sprout money. The west of the east this place could be, and now is the time for us to come make it good. We will occupy the people with tourism. So what if the old laws prohibit? Time to sweep it away, and you will manage it all. He talks and talks. There will be daisies and lotus flowers everywhere in spring. There are passion flowers in the summer, and right now, apples. So many apples on the grass, slowly rotting into the earth.
Thank you. You talk about princes and dividing kingdoms as well in your book. How does the struggle for power happen in your book?
So the prince, when I started working with the Silapatikaram, and it's a story of Kannagi and justice and a woman's demand for justice. But I actually became very interested in the character of Ilango Adigal, the person who's supposed to have written the Silapatikaram. And the story goes that Ilango Adigal, we don't know his real name, it's lost to us. So in this book he's called Uthiyan, but because he's a Chera prince, and that's a name that's found a lot in the Chera genealogies. But he has an elder brother called Shengutavan. And the story goes that there was a prophecy made that the younger son, Ilango Adigal, would be a great king, would make a great emperor. And when he heard this, he chose not to go down that path, but instead chose to renounce his claim to the throne. And he seems to have become a Jain monk or an ascetic. And then he goes on to compose this great poem, which is erotic in many respects. It has a love triangle between three people, Madhavi, Kovalan, and Kannagi. It's also got this whole bit where kings drop dead. And he dedicates it to his brother, Shengutavan. And one particular line, and this is the English translation, came to me that sums up much of what he's also talking about in the epic is, Dharma comes to kings in the shape of death. And this is fascinating because you think that this is a prince who has renounced his claim through the throne, writing an epic to his brother saying, almost like, watch out, brother, you better be a just king, otherwise this will happen to you. And that fascinated me. So I became very intrigued by the story about a young man who gives up his right to be king, and because that's quite an unusual choice. So that's where it came from. And also the power of storytelling to shape our ideals of what leadership can be or what justice can be, because the Shilapatikaram is a very important epic in Tamil discourse today. I mean, you have that statue of Kannagi pointing at Marina Beach. She has been such an icon for the political situation Karunanidhi himself wrote a script, Pumpuhar, which is based on the Shilapatikaram, and she's become such an icon for that movement. So I'm also, it's not that there is power of a certain kind, that power is in kingdoms and in power, but there is also power in writing a story that can shape people's ideals for generations to come. So it's interesting. I think he, in some ways, he did become a great man of another kind, not an emperor per se, but his legacy has lived on. Oh yeah. Okay. So since it's Republic Day, and we are talking about the state of the nation in other places, I feel this might be appropriate. So in this part of the text, Uthiyan, who is the Lango Adigal character, the prophecy has been revealed that he could be this great king, and his mother is in fact not, and his mother is kind of pushing him to be king. So I created something else. I created them being sons of different mothers. So he, being the youngest son, is the son of another queen, and she's kind of trying to egg her son on to become a king. And he's not very keen because he's very fond of his elder brother. Just imagine, the queen said, pacing the length of the room, just dream of the court you could create, the kingdom you could establish, the world you can build. Your brother and your father are alike, so preoccupied with the trivial matters of the court and the petty intrigues they engage in with other kings that they just can't see beyond into the future. She stopped in front of him and jabbed a finger into his chest. You, my son, you can. They dream of war and conquest and glory, of brutality, of tribute, but what do you dream of? Uthiyan shook his head. I do not dream of what is not mine. Nalchonai grabbed his hand and clutched it tightly. No! I know you and I dream of the same thing. A court, a kingdom, a world of beauty, not of endless wars and conflicts. Just imagine what we could create, what a kingdom of beauty might be like, a city of devas here on earth, a world of harmony. Perhaps his mother was right, Uthiyan wondered. Was this his duty? Was this his destiny? What kind of kingdom would he create? One of great beauty, Uthiyan decided, of silver and golden palaces and legions of dancing courtesans. One where he commanded an army of dancers and poets, not soldiers. A world where kings, instead of going to war on battlefields, wage war through other means. Battles of the mind fought with words, poets and philosophers debating the origins of the world and the forces that shape man's actions and the hungers that move the soul. A kingdom of ideas, poems, music and dance. Could this be, as his mother insisted, the will of the gods? Okay, I'll leave it there, but that kingdom is not created and will never exist.
We have a few minutes left, and we can take a couple of questions, if there are any. Could someone give a microphone, please?
Hi. I actually recently read a book by, I don't think it's an adaptation of the classics. I read One Indian Girl by Chetan Bhagat. And that's kind of inspiring this question. So there is women writing literature that is from a woman's lens, a feminist lens perhaps. And then there are men who are trying to adapt literature from a woman's lens again. And there are going to be differences between men trying to write literature from a feminist lens and a woman trying to write literature from a feminist lens. And I, as a man, because I'm a man, I was discovering what those differences are, but basically my question to you is like, what do you think are a few differences between those?
much for your question, and thank you so much for being so nuanced in your reading that you can actually point out those differences, because so many readers don't see that, that I think there is some differences between the ways in which some male writers write women's points of view and the way that feminist writers would write women's points of view. Like you were saying, lots of men are feminists, lots of women are patriarchs. I think if you are writing, then you're going to write brilliant women, because you can see those differences. And for me, I think, when I'm reading a male author who's writing a woman's point of view, not just a woman, I'm looking for a sense of bodily awareness. I think that is one of the most authentic things. One of my favourite writers in the world is John Coetzee, the author of a book called Disgrace. And, he has won the Nobel Prize, he's won the Booker Prize twice. The prizes don't matter to me because the writing itself is so good. But he does have one story in which he writes from a female point of view, a woman's voice. And this woman is getting dressed and she's thinking about how she's wearing these jeans because she wants to attract the man and this and this. And I lost interest in that character straight away, because I don't think women do dress for those reasons and think those things when they're dressing, right? So it's those kinds of details about how we perceive our own bodies that might make the difference to whether you can create a believable female character. Even if you don't aspire to being a feminist man, you can still create believable female characters if you respect that somebody has human equality with you on the inside, but bodily difference with you on the outside.
It's a different thing, but so when I wrote The Prince, I was doing the reverse. I was actually trying to be a woman, trying to imagine what it was like to be a man. And I can say one thing, I don't know if I've succeeded in creating a believable man, or if he'll come across as not quite, I don't know how much gender constructs the way we think a great deal. But I know that it was transformative for me to try that. Because I think any act of imagination, and forget what your audience is going to receive, any act of imagination where you're placing yourself in somebody else's shoes can be transformative. I know that I walked out of this book suddenly realizing, being much more comfortable with claiming aspects of myself that I had deemed masculine until that point, like being much more assertive, much more aggressive, demanding certain things. We consider these things masculine, but it's all in our heads, and we can change. And I think that's where storytelling is transformative. We can change what these things mean.
The person who thinks that someone might call you arrogant, and that in a different gender might be called confident. So, you can think about the ways in which you can use language and adjectives to describe your characters, and that's going to help people to understand that there is actually a gendered way that language works, that we need to fight against.
You see, I'm very happy that you are both authors of classics. In view of that, I want to have one question to you. Don't you feel that the modern women is more pressurized than the women in Sita's time?
Thank you for that question, sir.
Huh?
Thank you for that question. Is the modern woman more pressurized than in the times of the epics and the women of the epics and the myths? That she's actually undergoing a greater burden? That's a really fascinating question to think through. I think because we are carrying the burdens of the past in us in some ways, in our subconscious, these roles of what it is to be a good mother, a good wife, all of these ideas, but we're also trying to carve out who we are, which is something we don't quite know, what we could be. We're discovering our own potential. So in my own head, I feel this huge conflict all the time. This is the way my mother thinks, this is the way my grandmother thinks, they've all done these things. But I'm also at this moment, I have incredible possibility to decide for myself who I want to be. I don't know if that is a greater pressure or burden, but I do feel we have greater freedom than the women of the past. I don't know if that is an illusory freedom or a real freedom, but I think that. But at the same time, there's a lot more going on in our heads, a lot more cognitive dissonance, let me put it that way.
I feel like the women...
What is the ground reality?
I feel like for me, can I take that one on the ground reality? Like, my grandmother was in partition. She left everything in Lahore and she came to Delhi with the movement of millions of people at a very young age. My mother left in India again at a young age, to start a new life in a very, very difficult circumstances in Britain, which is a hugely racially divided country. I mean, yes, I have a lot more freedoms, but I respect so greatly the pressures that they lived with that I will never know so that I could have those freedoms, and I never forget that. When I think about the women who inspired them, my mother's name is Mira, you know, it's an epic name. It comes from a mythology that she chose to interpret to give her the strength to leave behind everything that she knew and start this new life so that her daughters could have an intellectual freedom and a social freedom that she didn't feel like she had. So we probably do have more freedoms. The women of the past, even the mythical ones, had to run hundreds of nights and palaces and dinner for father and be political women and all of these different things they had to do. They were running countries from behind the scenes.
Preti ma'am, you said that when you're writing dystopian fiction, you just hope that it wouldn't happen in reality. But in a way, you're also telling your reader that it might be a possibility. You're actually letting them, accept that as a reality because already we have seen it in our heads, right? So probably in dystopian scenario, don't we need more optimistic writing on this? Especially when you're retelling.
Question. Thank you. Okay, so the question you're really asking me is, in times of great political turmoil in reality, don't we need hopeful stories? Personally, I think that this book is, even though it's based on a tragedy, a great tragedy, many people don't survive. And it shows a world which is a lot like the world that we live in now, which is very unequal. Language allows us to hope. The question at the end of King Lear is implicit. It's what are we going to do now we can see this world clearly? It's on the reader not to shut the book and just, go and do the next thing in their lives, but to take that knowledge and go out in the world and make a difference. Just like when you reach the end of a film or a play, you don't just eat some popcorn and then go home, but you have to feel changed enough to take action, to take political action, to change the things you want to do. And so the hope is really beyond the book, and it lies in the reader's hands.